September the 1st, 1939. Germany attacks Poland. Adolf Hitler ignores Britain and France, which had promised to fight for Poland. Sunday, September the 3rd. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain broadcasts.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Danzig, taken from Germany after the First World War, welcomed its liberators. To many good Germans, the city's capture symbolized the end of the humiliating Treaty of Versailles. Hitler swept forward to congratulate his victorious troops. He said they'd rescued his people from Polish barbarism. The Germans thrust into Poland from the west and north. In 2 weeks, the Polish army had virtually ceased to exist. Warsaw was one of the few places to hold out. The Russians, by agreement with Germany, seized parts of Poland they claimed as theirs by right. The two conquerors met at Brest-Litovsk. It was the scene of the Russian surrender to Germany in 1918. The official German greeting in Russian said German soldiers had always respected Russian soldiers. The clash of Nazi and Communist was, for the moment, conveniently forgotten. The final bombardment of Warsaw began on September the 23rd. nearly 3 weeks, Warsaw Radio had defiantly played the Polish national anthem. On September the 27th, the anthem stopped. Warsaw was reduced to rubble. The capital's commander surrendered. Poland, swallowed by Germany and Russia, disappeared into a new dark age. Arrests, deportations, executions began. Britain's war started with a false alarm. September the 3rd.
I remember when the outbreak of war came, we were in the cabinet room at the moment that the ultimatum expired.
Lord Butler was then a junior minister.
And we were just beginning to congratulate the Prime Minister on his broadcast when we heard a terrible wailing, which of course was the first air raid siren. Chamberlain took it very seriously, and his wife then appeared with an enormous basket full of things for the night and thermos flasks and things to read and so on. And so we all went and sheltered. I went and sheltered after some delay in the Foreign Office. The whole of the Horse Guards Parade was completely empty of people, and there was nobody in sight anywhere. When I got there was no furniture, so I had to sit on the floor. And an air raid warden said that there would be no gas. But of course, there wasn't really any war for some time, apart from being no gas.
So, no war that day, or for many months. People settled down to enjoy the unexpected reprieve. It was perfect weather for a late holiday, or invading Poland. People had braced themselves for a grimmer war. Hospitals were cleared to take air raid casualties. The experts predicted over 1 million injured in 2 months. Children and their mothers evacuated from the cities, 1.5 million of them. For some, a nightmare. For others, an adventure.
We assembled in a playground rather like this. The kids were there, and the parents. Children had the gas mask over their shoulder and labels tied to them.
The women had to decide whether to keep their school children with them or whether to allow them to go out. Now, one would think that this was an easy decision. Why not keep your children with you, which is the natural thing to do? But against this was the terrible thought that there was going to be gas, that there was going to be terrible bombing and death, and the children would be maimed.
Everyone was crying, the parents and children. And as we moved off, especially, people burst into tears. My mother, I think, was more unhappy about the wrench of us going rather than the war itself. My sister was crying. I personally wasn't. I was rather excited at the prospect of leaving this part of London. We thought we'd travel to the other side of the world, but in fact we came to Denham, here, only 20 miles from London. I promised my mother that I wouldn't be separated from my sister, so we went to the village hall with all the other kids. And because we wouldn't be separated, we were the last ones to find a billet. It was like being auctioned off at the time. But when we finally got a house to take us in, it was fantastic. It was a new world that opened out to us. I mean, we had toothbrushes and sheets on the bed and hot water. Imagine hot water. We just couldn't get over it, and we didn't know what eiderdowns were for. In the morning, we went blackberry picking. Then we heard the sirens. So we rushed back to our billet. The woman there reassured us and said not to worry. And we sat down to lunch, and it was the first fully laid out table I'd ever seen in my life. And war was declared, I think, that same lunchtime. She said not to worry and passed us the horseradish sauce.
But I think a number of children suffered really deeply being away from their families. They suffered a sense of rejection. They exhibited their senses of rejection and sorrow and suffering very often by strange behavior problems, by bedwetting, perhaps not eating.
31 arrived with 2 junior nurses, I think. They were pretty dirty, and 2 of them got impetigo. I had young children at the time. And I put them into a large room, and you've no idea, I had no idea that such things exist in England. They relieved themselves all over the carpet, and the place was a shambles.
There was no heroic rush to volunteer for the forces. You waited your turn to be called up for processing in the military sausage machine, or rather leisurely. A rush to get married. In August and September, the highest number of weddings ever recorded. White's the only way. White for the blackout, too, to make sure car drivers can see you in the dark. At first, the blackout was a bit of a joke. Then road casualties shot up, and the blackout wasn't funny anymore. There weren't any air raids, but thousands of people were killed or injured in accidents in the blackout. Depressing, too. Without it, you could almost forget there was a war on. Every night, every home had to be blacked out. The air raid warden, looking for chinks of light, became more hated than Hitler. The government closed cinemas and other entertainments at the beginning of the war, but a fortnight later they were allowed to open again. In spite of total war, there were nearly 1.5 million unemployed. Sir John Simon, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, introduced an emergency budget.
In 3 hours' time, all budget secrets will be revealed. I am confident that whatever may be the burdens which have to be carried by the British taxpayer, my fellow countrymen will bear them with the same resolution and courage as our fighting men will show when they discharge their grimmer task on the field of battle.
The blackout budget. Income tax up to 7 and 6, a 60% tax on excess profits. In retrospect, mild enough. But a Conservative MP, Chips Channon, thought it demolished the edifice of capitalism. Another Tory, Leo Amery, wanted a tougher war. Why not bomb Germany? The Air Minister, Kingsley Wood, said no. German munition works were private property, and the Germans would retaliate.
Well, the opening phase of the war was one of the most extraordinary periods through which I've ever lived, because it was a sort of period of euphoria on the part of the people of this country. For a long time, there were quite a lot of unemployed, while the Germans were manufacturing arms at full stretch, particularly in the Skoda works in Czechoslovakia, which they had by that time occupied. Now, all this time, the Germans were a beehive of activity. We were doing absolutely nothing. We'd gone to war for the defense of Poland. In the event, we did nothing to help Poland at all. We never lifted a finger. For the first 3 months of the war, the greatest number of casualties were in the blackout. And we confined our war effort to dropping leaflets on the German people, telling them that it was a bad idea to go to war and that it was a pity that they'd done it, and perhaps we might make peace.
A phony war. When a German plane crashed in Scotland in November, people came from miles around to see it. And the Luftwaffe's dead were buried with full military honors. Three British divisions went off to France at the beginning of the war. More followed. Nearly 200,000 men, said the War Minister proudly. The French had mobilized 6 million men. They grumbled that the British weren't taking the war seriously.
Wish me luck as you wave me goodbye. Cheerio, here I go on my way.
In France, training for a war that ended in 1918. The newsreel reporter tried hard to make it sound impressive.
The expeditionary force, instead of being thrown into the line for immediate operations, has been able to perfect its training in conditions similar to those at home. This bayonet drill in gas masks is our reply to transparent Nazi propaganda, which seems to indicate that Germany is preparing to employ poison gas. Infantry battalions exercise with their auxiliary weapons, awaiting the moment for their use in actual warfare. The mortar platoon goes into action with a rapidity only acquired by constant practice. Steel helmets assume a fashionable appearance with the addition of camouflage.
French and British generals, too, prepared for their part in the battle to come. The British dug in on the Belgian frontier. In December, it was decided that when fighting began, they'd leave their defenses and advance into Belgium. Anything helped to keep their minds off the war.
Now imagine me in the Maginot Line, sitting on a mine in the Maginot Line. Now it's turned out nice again, the army life is fine. French girls make a fuss of me. I'm not French as you can see, but I know what they mean when they say wee wee down on the Maginot Line. Now imagine me in the Maginot Line, sitting on the mine in the Maginot Line. Now it's turned out nice again, the army life is fine. At night myself to sleep I sing, to my old tin hat I cling. I have to use it now for everything.
Winston's back, the Navy was told on September the 3rd. Chamberlain was reluctant to recall his most bitter political opponent with a reputation for military adventure. But Churchill was popular with the public. He had warned them war was coming. Now, with surprising energy for a 64-year-old, he proved a willing leader. The RAF dropped leaflets, the army dug trenches, but Churchill's navy was Britain's strongest arm. And the First Lord of the Admiralty was often in the news.
We are in a very different position from that we were in 10 weeks ago. We are far stronger than we were 10 weeks ago. We are far better prepared to endure the worst malice of Hitler and his Huns than we were at the beginning of September.
The news that a German battleship was sinking British merchantmen gave the chance to take the offensive. Churchill concentrated much of the Navy's strength on finding her. One of the hunting groups patrolled off the River Plate in South America. 3 cruisers, Exeter, Ajax, and Achilles. At dawn on December the 13th, they sighted a heavier German ship. It was the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee. Although outgunned, the cruisers engaged her. The Battle of the River Plate began.
Within about 5 minutes of the alarm being sounded, Graf Spee and Exeter were shooting at each other, and the Ajax and Achilles were both shooting at the Graf Spee, concentrating their gunfire. The Exeter was quite soon hit and received early damage. Her foremost guns only fired a few rounds each before they were out of action. She continued as long as she possibly could with her after turret, but the ship herself was badly damaged. Her speed was reduced. The 6-inch gun cruisers before long turned directly towards the Graf Spee so as to close the range still faster, and the captain of the Graf Spee did not follow up the Exeter entirely, but indeed before very long started heading towards Montevideo. But we could not see any spectacular damage inflicted on him, and indeed his speed seemed to be unimpaired, and his heavy guns were still firing regularly and with pretty good accuracy.
In Montevideo, the Graf Spee took on fuel and put ashore the crews of the merchant ship she'd sunk. Her captain, Langsdorff, asked the Uruguayans for permission to stay, but was told he must clear the port in 72 hours. So he buried his dead. And believing that much heavier British ships were waiting for him outside, he prepared to carry out his final orders from Berlin.
As soon as he started pulling his anchor up, we got news of it from our people ashore, and we sent off our aircraft, and in due course we got the signal from the aircraft, which was a very welcome one. Graf Spee has blown herself up.
2 days later, Langsdorff shot himself. Churchill made the most of a victory won by bluff rather than gunpower. 2 of the cruisers were brought home. Their crews marched through the city of London to Guildhall, and the First Lord of the Admiralty basked in their glory.
The brilliant sea fight which you executed, those who are here executed, takes its place in our naval annals, and I may add that in a dark, cold winter, it warmed the cockles of the British heart.
Helsinki, November the 30th, 1939. Finland has refused to hand over bases and territory demanded by her neighbor Russia. The Russians attack. The massive Russian army crossed the frontier, apparently set for the kind of easy victory the Germans had had in Poland. But the Finns, few in number, fought back. Camouflaged Finnish ski troops knew how to use their own conditions, moving round the Russian flanks, cutting their supply lines. The Russian advance ground to a halt, confirming the German belief that the Russian army, purged by Stalin of many of its regular officers, couldn't fight. Whole Russian divisions were destroyed. Those who weren't taken prisoner died in the snow. For the Russians, a humiliating, if temporary, failure. In Britain, it was snowing too. The censorship tried to hush it up, but people couldn't help noticing. To the trials of the blackout were added the worst winter for 45 years. A coal shortage, burst pipes, and food rationing. The RAF was grounded. Troops were called in to keep the trains running. For the Navy, another victory. Taking refuge in a Norwegian fjord, the Graf Spe's supply ship Altmark was cornered by British destroyers. Ignoring Norwegian neutrality, they boarded her and, after a fight, released 300 British prisoners. For Hitler, the seizure of the Altmark was a setback. He hastened his plans to invade Norway. For Churchill, another popular triumph. He too had his eyes on Norway. Churchill's colleagues had been discussing for months his plan for British action in Norway. But some, like the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, were difficult to persuade. Churchill now added a plan to help Finland as part of the Norwegian operation. He proposed to stop Germany's important supply of iron ore, which came from Sweden to the Norwegian port of Narvik. Then it was shipped to Germany through neutral Norwegian waters. Churchill wanted to mine the waters, and he added enticingly that if Narvik were captured, it could be used as a base for helping Finland against communist Russia. Churchill knew that his plan might mean retaliation by Hitler in Norway, and helping Finland could mean war with Russia. Chamberlain was concerned about innocent Norwegian lives and the effect on American opinion. Eventually, he was persuaded.
I think that deep down, he still hoped that perhaps the major clash of armies could be avoided. He thought that Germany was on the verge of starvation, or if not on the verge of starvation, it anyhow would be brought to the verge of starvation by economic warfare. And he thought also that deep down the German people didn't support Hitler, that this was a clique, and that if we did our propaganda properly, there would perhaps be a revolt of the generals or somebody else against Hitler, and that therefore dropping propaganda leaflets by Bomber Command of the RAF rather than bombs was a good way of conducting the war, anything to stop the real major outbreak. And that is why I think to some extent the campaigns in Norway were something acceptable to Chamberlain, because it kept the war distant. It kept the idea of a real big clash, a repetition of Passchendaele or the Somme, far away. It meant that war would be localized and perhaps some miracle would happen. Perhaps Hitler would die or be assassinated, and the whole thing would end with the minimum of bloodshed.
Finland today, amidst her snows and her frozen lakes, is fighting against the forces of unscrupulous violence, just as we are ourselves. As her need calls for our sympathy and our aid,
some British aid did go to Finland, but little and late. The Russians at last brought all their weight to bear and overwhelmed the Finnish defenses. The day the British steeled themselves to force a landing in Norway, Finland surrendered. So Britain was saved from war against Russia and Germany at the same time. The armistice terms gave Russia most of what she wanted. Hundreds of thousands of Finns had to evacuate their homes. The French Prime Minister Daladier had staked everything on helping Finland. He was replaced by Paul Reynaud. Reynaud went on pressing for Churchill's operation to cut off the German iron ore. An Allied meeting in London decided to mine Norwegian waters. Churchill had got his way. British and French troops stood ready to invade Norway. The mines were laid on April the 8th. A few days earlier, no thought of Norway in his mind, Chamberlain had proclaimed that Hitler had missed the bus, and General Ironside dared the Germans to do their worst. Hitler's invasion force sailed on April the 6th. The Luftwaffe took over most of the Norwegian airfields. The German march into Oslo was led by a band. Norway had no standing army, only half-trained militia. The Norwegians were anti-militarist by tradition, and they had seen German newsreels of the Blitzkrieg on Poland. No one wanted Oslo to go the way of Warsaw. There was little resistance. The Allied operation in Norway was a muddle from the start. Troops were embarked, disembarked, embarked again, without vital equipment. A contingent of French troops sailed with the British, plentifully equipped. Unlike the British, they were trained for winter conditions, but they hadn't got straps for their skis. Even the expedition's objectives were confused. Trondheim in central Norway was to be captured by a pincer attack from Andelsnes and Namsos. So some troops were diverted south. But Churchill's mind was still fixed on Narvik, and it was there the first battle took place. The Navy bombarded Narvik, and German destroyers already there took a battering. But the advantage was lost. The British Army commander didn't make a direct assault on the town. British territorials did land at Namsos and Andelsnes. They had no skis, no proper maps of Norway, and no heavy guns. There was little they could do when they ran into the well-equipped Germans. Captain Martin Lindsay was with the British force at Namsos.
There really was no hope at all for this operation because it was entirely improvised at short notice and in a great hurry, and the force had no aircraft supporting it and no artillery. But even more important, all the ground was covered with snow, and the only way to operate was with ski troops, and we hadn't got ski troops. And therefore the troops were confined to the road, and whenever the Germans got onto the hills on the flank, they had no alternative but to retire.
The British had come to protect the Norwegians, but they couldn't stop the Luftwaffe from blitzing the little Norwegian towns. German control of the Norwegian airfields was the key to the battle. The Germans advanced, capturing hundreds of British prisoners. Some of these were flown to Berlin and paraded before Hitler. Others were put in front of German newsreel cameras.
You seem to be in a pretty good mood here. Obviously, you don't find Germans as bad as you expected them, do you?
Oh, no, certainly not.
No.
I was captured at Forberg by the Germans. From there, I came to Littlehammer. And we had a supper. Consisted of brown bread, gorgonzola, wine, which the Germans gave to us, cigarettes. We had a hot meal each day. And we're getting on fairly decent. And I hope the war will soon be over and we'll all be going back home.
Most of them did go home, ingloriously, abandoning Andalsnes and Namsos still burning. Chased by the Luftwaffe, the Norwegian campaign rammed home the lesson that sea power without air power could no longer win battles. Their only battle honor the part they played in bringing down a government. For now the machinery of democracy began to work. As the troops disembarked, an angry parliament was assembling to debate the disaster. Feeling cut across party lines. Captain Lindsay, a Tory, went to the leader of the Labour opposition.
Well, I was the first person from this force to reach London, and I went straight to see Mr. Attlee on the morning of the first day of the debate, and I gave him a memorandum about the appalling improvisation and deficiencies in Norway, because I was quite convinced that we should lose the war if we went on like that, which he gave to Herbert Morrison to help him open for the opposition that afternoon.
The Norway debate was the only decisive debate I had ever attended during my 34 years as a member of the House of Commons, because it was the only division which definitely brought about the fall of a government.
For nearly a year before that debate, there had been a piling up of bitterness and anguish in the breasts of people who wanted Britain to go all out and win the war against Hitler. And so you can imagine that the debate was a very fierce one, not only the Labour opposition, but also Conservatives. They felt that the whole conduct of the war could not be carried on under a man whom they had already assailed at the time of Munich, and whom they realized he was not really by nature a war leader.
Gradually, the temperature began to rise, and when Herbert Morrison for the Labour Party announced that they were going to divide at the end of the debate against the government, there was an action group of which Clement Davis was chairman, the Liberal leader, and I was secretary. It was an all-party committee committed to pressing for more decisive action during the war and a more vigorous posture and a more vigorous prosecution of the war. And we decided to hold a meeting after Morrison's announcement, and we asked Leo Amery to preside over it. And it was an enormously attended meeting. There were a great many Conservative members of Parliament there, and I felt something was happening. And there was a great many members of Parliament who had never been hitherto members of our action group who fetched up at the meeting, and the feeling at the meeting was passionate. And I felt at that time that a great many Conservative members were not only prepared to abstain in the division, but even to vote against the government. And I came down from that meeting with feelings of great tension. Meanwhile, Churchill had been putting up a great defense of the government. And it was ironical again there, because the debate was about Norway, and Norway had been a series of disasters for which, although he might not be blamed, because they may have been unavoidable, and I think were unavoidable, he was directly responsible as First Lord of the Admiralty. And Amery made a most formidable speech in which he quoted Cromwell's words, "You have been here long enough for any good you have done. In the name of God, go." And then Lloyd George came down and made the most devastating speech I've ever heard even him make, in which he concluded by saying to Chamberlain, "You have asked the nation for sacrifices, but there is one sacrifice that is more necessary than any other, and that is the sacrifice of your own office." And when the result of the division was announced, and the Conservative majority fell to about 80, and that meant the fall of the government in the circumstances, I could see Chamberlain, I can see him now, blanch. He had asked for friendship from those who were his friends, and he hadn't got it. And he walked out of the chamber a solitary figure, and I felt very sorry for him at that moment, because I knew that he was done.
And I remember Chamberlain going to his room afterwards and saying he wondered whether this could go on. But it wasn't until the next day that he really realized that his pay number was up. On that particular day, the whips, I think, tried to explain to him that it might have been worse and that sort of thing. But those of us who were with him could see the writing on the wall by that time.
During those 2 days, the 9th and 10th of May, there was great doubt as to who would succeed Chamberlain. And the Labour Party made it clear that if there was to be a coalition government, which by now everybody thought necessary, they would not serve under Chamberlain. The choice, therefore, was between Churchill and Halifax.
Lord Halifax was the obvious successor, Chamberlain's trusted colleague. But no peer had been Prime Minister for nearly 40 years. As for his rival,
Churchill was viewed with grave misgiving by the establishment, as it would now be called. Everybody at 10 Downing Street and Whitehall generally, the cabinet offices, and in very large sectors of the Conservative Party were frightened of Churchill. They thought he was an adventurer. They remembered Gallipoli. They thought that they did not want to see the fortunes of this country at a most critical moment in its whole history handed over to somebody who might do the most extraordinary things and undertake the most astonishing adventures. And they all, after all, realized that Norway, this fiasco from which we were just hoping to recover, or had just been saved in the nick of time, was largely the inspiration of Churchill. It was a very fine idea, but it didn't work, just like Gallipoli. And therefore, it was with a certain amount of fear of Churchill that I think the minds of most people in the centre of government and in the centre of Whitehall turned towards Halifax. Halifax was safe. He was clever, he was a fellow of all souls, He was a man of indisputable charm and absolute integrity, and it was hoped that he would perhaps be sent for by the king.
The Labour Party approached me, Hugh Dalton and Herbert Morrison, and they both talked in favour of Halifax, and they thought that Halifax ought to take over, and I think their idea always was that Churchill would run the war under Halifax, an idea which didn't appeal to Halifax.
I remember Churchill telling me that the critical moment came when Chamberlain asked Halifax and him to join him in the cabinet room. And the three of them were there. Halifax was sitting beside Chamberlain, who suddenly turned to Churchill and said, "Tell me, Winston, do you see any reason why in the 20th century a Prime Minister should not be in the House of Lords?" And Churchill thought that this was a trap, because if he said, "No, I see no reason at all," he thought Chamberlain would turn to Halifax and say, "In that case, if the king were to ask my advice, I could perhaps suggest you." On the other hand, it would be very difficult for him to say, "Yes, I do," because then there could be no alternative but himself. And so he turned round and stood staring over the Horse Guards parade and did not reply to the question.
The decision, I think, was largely taken by Halifax, who told me he had a pain in his stomach an hour or two before the meeting and did not really want to be Prime Minister. Whereas the man who really did want to be Prime Minister, in fact he was quite determined on it, was Churchill.
At dawn that morning, the Germans swept into Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg. The war was at last coming very close home to Britain. As the Allied armies braced themselves for battle, Chamberlain went to the palace to resign and advised the king to send for Churchill.
Churchill would be a gamble, and perhaps when you're at a very serious moment of your lives, a gamble is not the thing to undertake. And so it was with great despair that we all heard on the evening of the 10th of May that the king had sent for Churchill.